She trusted him with her life, but he had a plan to take it. What happens when the prey becomes the hunter? Lillian Monroe stood in the grand hallway of her sprawling estate, the soft glow of the evening sun casting a warm golden light across the marble floors. Her fingers delicately held a small bowl of fresh cherries, a simple treat she had picked up after her prenatal yoga session. She smiled to herself, thinking of surprising her husband Henry with this little gesture. But as she approached the master bedroom, her world shifted. A faint murmur of Henry's voice drifted through the slightly ajar door. At first, she thought it was a routine business call, but something in his tone, cold, calculated, dripping with satisfaction, made her pause. "Yes, I've handled it." Henry's voice was low but clear, a cruel edge coloring his words. "Tonight's the night. She'll never see it coming. Just one little push is all it takes." The bowl slipped from Lillian's trembling fingers, cherries tumbling across the polished floor, their bright red juice staining the pristine white tiles like scattered drops of blood. Her heart pounded, each beat a thunderous drum in her ears. She pressed herself against the wall, forcing herself to breathe, to listen. "She signed everything over last week," Henry continued, his voice thick with smug satisfaction. "The will, the assets, it's all mine now. Once she's gone, there won't be anyone left to challenge me." Shock and disbelief washed over Lillian, a cold, paralyzing wave that left her frozen in place. Henry's words weren't just betrayal, they were a death sentence. The man she loved, the father of her unborn child, was planning to kill her. But even in the depths of that horror, Lillian's mind began to race. Years of watching her father manage the Monroe family empire had taught her one thing: never show your hand too soon. She didn't cry, didn't panic. Instead, she moved with quiet precision, retreating silently down the corridor, her bare feet whispering against the cold tiles. She entered her private study, the place that had once been her father's sanctuary. There, locked in a hidden drawer, were documents, a safety net her father's lawyers had insisted upon, legal papers that Henry had no idea existed. Papers that proved everything he thought he had taken was still legally hers. Her hands trembled, but her mind was clear. Lillian grabbed her phone and dialed a number she had hoped she would never need. "Daniel, it's Lillian." Her voice was a whisper, but her words were steel. "I need the rescue team at the marina by 10. No lights, no sound. Wear dark clothes and wait for my signal." "Lillian, what's going on?" Daniel's voice was tense, his loyalty unshakable. "For now, I'm still safe," she whispered, her gaze drifting to the doorway, her ears straining for any sound of Henry's approach. "But Henry thinks he's orchestrating a tragedy. Let's give him exactly what he expects, until we don't." The hours that followed were a blur. Lillian maintained her calm facade, even as Henry greeted her with a warm smile, his arms wrapping around her in a deceitful embrace. She smiled back, though her heart raced beneath her calm exterior. By nightfall, she found herself walking beside Henry along the marina's docks, her arm looped loosely around his. To any passerby, they appeared the perfect couple, wealthy, beautiful, madly in love. But beneath her serene smile was a storm of determination. Henry led her aboard their luxury yacht, the Serafina, its deck bathed in soft moonlight. The crew had been dismissed, leaving them alone. Perfect, just as he had planned. "To us," Henry toasted, handing her a glass of champagne. "To us," Lillian echoed, raising the glass to her lips, but never drinking. She leaned against the railing, gazing out at the vast, dark expanse of water. Her fingers brushed against the concealed life jacket beneath her flowing navy dress, a lifeline Henry knew nothing about. "Do you trust me, Lillian?" Henry's voice was soft, almost tender. "With my life," she replied, her eyes never leaving the horizon. And then it happened. A swift, brutal shove. Henry's hands connected with her chest, and she felt herself falling, the cold wind rushing past her as the dark water rose to meet her. But beneath the surface, Lillian remained eerily calm. The life jacket buoyed her upward, but she stayed submerged, counting the seconds, listening to the muffled sound of Henry's frantic curses above. "Lillian, where are you?" he shouted, his voice tinged with feigned panic. 30 seconds passed. Then 60. And then she swam, silently, toward the rendezvous point where a dark speedboat waited just beyond sight. Strong arms pulled her aboard, and Daniel's familiar voice whispered in her ear, "You're safe." Lillian glanced back at the yacht, its silhouette fading into the distance. A cold smile touched her lips. "Let him think he won," she murmured, her voice steady as steel, "because the game is far from over." In the early morning hours, the speedboat cut silently through the dark waters, carrying Lillian Monroe away from the nightmare she had just escaped. Daniel Carter, her loyal friend, kept his focus on the horizon, his hands steady on the controls, his jaw clenched with quiet determination. "We're clear now," Daniel whispered, his voice calm but urgent. "He has no idea you're alive." Lillian leaned back, her damp hair clinging to her cheeks, her breathing finally steadying. She stared at the receding lights of the marina, a cold fire igniting within her. Good. Let him believe his plan worked. The boat slipped into a hidden cove where a small, unmarked car waited. Daniel helped Lillian ashore, his hand never leaving her shoulder. "We need to keep you hidden, at least until we figure out our next move." "I already know my next move," Lillian replied, her voice steady, her eyes fierce. "But first, I need to disappear completely." In the days that followed, Lillian became a ghost. Daniel secured a secluded mountain cabin for her, miles away from the bustling city she once ruled. Surveillance cameras surrounded the property, and only a trusted few knew of her survival. But Lillian was far from idle. Each day, she meticulously reviewed documents on her laptop, financial records, legal documents, and security feeds that Daniel had set up to monitor the Monroe estate. Henry believed he had inherited everything, but Lillian knew the truth. She still controlled more than he realized. Every piece of the puzzle was falling into place. The safety net her late father's lawyers had established years ago remained intact, protecting her assets from being easily transferred. Henry had signed away his rights without even knowing it, blinded by greed. But Henry wasn't her only concern. Sabrina Hale, his lover and co-conspirator, had moved into the Monroe estate almost immediately after Lillian's death. The sight of Sabrina lounging in Lillian's garden, wearing her jewelry, sipping wine on the veranda, each image captured by Daniel's surveillance cameras, only fueled Lillian's resolve. "They think they've won," she whispered one evening, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the table. "But they don't understand the game." Daniel sat across from her, his expression a mix of concern and admiration. "Are you sure you want to go through with this? Disappearing is one thing, but returning, that's war." "It was war the moment they decided to kill me," Lillian replied coldly. "I'm not just going to take back what's mine, I'm going to make them wish they'd never crossed me." Each night, she studied the footage Daniel provided. Sabrina laughing with Henry, the two of them hosting lavish parties in her home, spending her money. But Lillian wasn't just watching, she was learning, studying their weaknesses, their habits, and their growing arrogance. She also began preparing herself, mentally, physically, and legally. Daniel connected her with a network of trusted allies, lawyers, investigators, and financial experts who quietly worked to secure her assets, document Henry's fraudulent activities, and prepare for the storm she intended to unleash. "You're not just taking back your life, Lillian," Daniel warned one night, his voice low and serious. "You're tearing theirs apart." Lillian's gaze never wavered. "They built their new life on a grave they thought they had filled. Let's see how they handle living in its shadow." Weeks turned into months, and Lillian's plans grew sharper, more intricate. She carefully reached out to former allies, whispering the truth of her survival to a select few. Thomas Blake, a senior board member at Monroe Enterprises and a longtime family friend, was the first to swear his loyalty. "I knew something was wrong the moment Henry took over," Thomas whispered during a secret meeting at a remote cafe. "The way he seized control. It wasn't just ambition, it was desperation." "Desperation makes people careless," Lillian replied, a faint smile touching her lips. "And arrogance makes them blind." Thomas became her eyes and ears within the company, feeding her information about Henry's reckless decisions, his growing influence, and the quiet discontent among the staff. Monroe Enterprises was rotting from within, a slow decay hidden beneath a facade of prosperity. But for Lillian, the game had only just begun. Each night, she stood before the large window of the cabin, staring out at the dark mountains, her reflection a ghostly silhouette. Her hand instinctively rested on the subtle curve of her growing belly, a silent reminder of the life she was fighting to protect. "You tried to kill me, Henry," she whispered to the darkness, "but you only made me stronger." Daniel entered the room quietly, his expression cautious. "Are you ready for the next step?" Lillian turned, her gaze cold and determined. "Yes, it's time to let them feel my presence, without even knowing I'm here." 3 months had passed since Lillian Monroe's supposed death, and Henry Caldwell's world had transformed. He was the grieving widower, the heartbroken husband who had tragically lost his wife in a boating accident. The media portrayed him as a man shattered by loss, but anyone who saw him in private knew the truth. Henry thrived. With Lillian gone, he had taken full control of Monroe Enterprises, reshaping the company to suit his ambitions. Lavish parties filled the Monroe estate, where he and Sabrina Hale played host, their laughter echoing through the grand halls once filled with Lillian's quiet grace. Sabrina quickly embraced her new role as the queen of the mansion. She wore Lillian's jewelry, redecorated the living rooms with modern, gaudy furniture, and pranced about the garden, sipping expensive wine. To the world, she was the grieving husband's comfort. But in truth, she was his accomplice, ambitious, manipulative, and just as deceitful. Yet amidst the laughter and luxury, a shadow began to creep over their perfect life. It started with a letter. Sabrina opened it one sunny morning as she lounged by the pool, her silk robe catching the breeze. The envelope was plain, unmarked, but the message inside was chilling in its simplicity. "Some ghosts don't haunt. They return." Her laughter died on her lips. Sabrina's fingers trembled, but she quickly dismissed it as a cruel prank, crumpling the note and tossing it aside. But as the days passed, more letters appeared, left on the doorstep, slipped beneath her dressing room door. Sent through the mail with no return address, Henry dismissed her fears. "It's probably some bitter ex-employee or a bored neighbor," he scoffed, brushing off her growing paranoia. "We have everything, Sabrina. No one can touch us." But Sabrina's unease only deepened. She became jumpy, suspicious of every shadow, every unfamiliar face at their parties. The staff whispered about her growing paranoia, and Henry's patience wore thin. "You're letting this nonsense get to you," he snapped one night, pouring himself another glass of scotch. "We won, Sabrina." "We have everything. Lillian is gone." "But what if she isn't?" Sabrina whispered, her voice barely audible. Henry's glass paused halfway to his lips, a cold smile playing on his face. "She's at the bottom of the bay, Sabrina, where she belongs." But even Henry couldn't completely ignore the strange occurrences. His business deals began to falter. Confidential documents disappeared, only to reappear weeks later with strange annotations. Key partners suddenly backed out of lucrative deals, citing concerns they refused to elaborate on. And then came the emails. Anonymous messages filled his inbox, each one more cryptic than the last. "A widow's sorrow can be a powerful weapon. She trusted you. But did you trust her? What lies beneath the water always rises." Henry's confident facade began to crack. He changed passwords, tightened security, and fired 2 of his assistants, suspecting them of betrayal. but nothing stopped the messages. The mansion, once a symbol of his victory, began to feel like a prison. But for Lillian, hidden away in her mountain retreat, each day brought a quiet satisfaction. Daniel provided her with regular updates, photos of Sabrina pacing the garden, Henry's growing anger at his faltering business, and the whispers among the staff. "They're unraveling," Daniel reported one evening, leaning against the doorway of her study. "Sabrina is paranoid. Henry is furious. They're lashing out at each other." Lillian leaned back in her chair, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Good. Fear is a powerful weapon." "You're sure this is the right way?" Daniel asked cautiously. "Pushing them, playing with them like this?" "They deserve worse," Lillian replied coldly. "But I'm not here to give them a quick end. I want them to feel what I felt. Trapped, powerless, betrayed." But Lillian's plan was more than just torment. Every letter, every message, every subtle disruption was calculated. She wasn't just frightening them, she was gathering proof. Each reaction, each desperate attempt to cover their tracks, only exposed more of their guilt. "They think they're alone," she whispered, staring at the live surveillance feed of the mansion. "But they're being watched." And so the game continued. Sabrina's glamorous parties became strained, her laughter forced. Guests whispered about her erratic behavior, and some stopped attending altogether. Henry's once flawless reputation began to tarnish as rumors spread of his aggressive outbursts and failed deals. One evening, as Sabrina poured another glass of wine, she noticed a small card slipped beneath the wine bottle. Her heart raced as she read the familiar message. "You can steal a life, but you can't escape the consequences." She screamed, the glass shattering on the marble floor. Henry stormed in, demanding to know what had happened. But Sabrina's words were a jumbled mess, her fear overwhelming her. "It's her, Henry! It's Lillian!" Henry grabbed her by the shoulders, forcing her to look into his eyes. "Stop this madness!" "She's dead. I made sure of it." But his voice wavered. His grip tightened, and for the first time, Sabrina saw the fear in his eyes. They thought they had buried Lillian Monroe, but Lillian was very much alive. Lillian Monroe's plan was in motion, but it was far from over. Hidden away in her secluded mountain cabin, she watched with calculated patience as Henry Caldwell and Sabrina Hale's lives began to unravel. Fear was a weapon, but knowledge was even more powerful. From her secure laptop, Lillian monitored the live feeds from the hidden cameras Daniel Carter had installed around the Monroe estate. Each screen was a window into the life that Henry and Sabrina had stolen, a life they now lived in constant fear. Sabrina had become a shadow of her former self. Once the confident, glamorous woman who had stolen Lillian's husband, she now jumped at every whisper, her eyes constantly darting toward dark corners. The once grand parties she had hosted grew smaller, less frequent, and guests whispered about the strained look in her eyes. But Henry was different. Where Sabrina saw shadows, Henry saw enemies. His temper flared at the smallest inconvenience. He fired 3 staff members in a single week, accusing them of disloyalty. His business meetings became hostile, and his investors grew wary of his erratic behavior. Lillian smiled each time she watched him pace his study, his phone clutched in a white-knuckled grip as he barked orders to his security team. He tried to trace the anonymous messages, the letters, the emails that seemed to taunt him at every turn. But there was nothing to find. Each message led to a dead end. Each threat was a ghost. "Are you ready for the next step?" Daniel asked one cool evening, leaning against the doorway of Lillian's study. His voice was calm, but his eyes held a quiet admiration for her relentless focus. Lillian's gaze never left the screen. "Yes, they're beginning to crumble. Now it's time to tighten the noose." Her next move was simple: divide and conquer. Fear and paranoia were already wedged between Henry and Sabrina. Now she would turn that wedge into a chasm. It began with a single, carefully chosen photo. Sabrina, sipping wine on the veranda, wearing a silk robe, Lillian's robe, a subtle but unmistakable reminder of who truly belonged in that house. The photo arrived on Henry's desk one quiet morning, delivered in a plain, unmarked envelope. No message, no signature, just Sabrina, lounging like a queen in stolen luxury. Henry's reaction was immediate. His face twisted in rage, and that evening, the mansion echoed with their shouts. "Are you flaunting her things now?"
"Is this a joke to you?" Henry's voice thundered through the halls. Sabrina's fear turned to indignation. "I'm not the one losing my mind." "You said she was gone, Henry, dead, but I keep seeing her." "Because you're weak," he spat.
"You're letting fear get to you." But even as he yelled, Henry's hands trembled. He saw the look in Sabrina's eyes, the growing suspicion, the doubt. The next day, another photo arrived. This time, a snapshot of Henry, taken through the window of his office, his expression tense, his phone pressed to his ear. A message was scrawled beneath it in delicate handwriting. "Sometimes the hunter is the hunted." Henry's paranoia became a fever. He demanded new security protocols, ordered his guards to search the property, but they found nothing. Sabrina, meanwhile, withdrew further, locking herself in the bedroom, avoiding the garden where she felt the walls had eyes. Lillian watched it all, her calm exterior masking a quiet satisfaction. But she was not just tormenting them. She was learning. Each reaction, each outburst, each desperate attempt to regain control revealed more of their weaknesses. "They're tearing each other apart," Daniel observed one evening, handing her a fresh stack of reports. "Henry's losing his grip, and Sabrina is one breath away from fleeing." "Good," Lillian whispered, her voice cold as winter. "But not yet. Not until I have everything." Through Thomas Blake, her ally within Monroe Enterprises, Lillian's web of control expanded. Henry's reckless decisions were documented, his misuse of company funds quietly recorded. Each misstep, each careless indulgence, was another nail in his coffin. "Henry's burning through the accounts," Thomas reported in a hushed phone call. "The board is starting to ask questions." "If this continues—" "It will continue," Lillian assured him. "And when the time is right, they'll turn on him." Her confidence was not arrogance. It was strategy. Henry's greed and Sabrina's fear were her greatest allies. They were already falling apart. She just had to push them a little further. One quiet night, as the rain pattered against the cabin windows, Lillian stood by the fire, her fingers tracing the silver locket around her neck, a gift from her father, engraved with a simple phrase, "Strength through patience." "Soon," she whispered, her reflection shimmering in the glass. "They'll destroy each other, and I'll be there to watch." But Lillian's calm was not without caution. She knew that Henry was dangerous, and fear could make him unpredictable. That was why she never moved without a plan, never acted without an escape. And as the mansion grew darker, as the laughter faded, as the whispers grew louder, Lillian's shadow stretched ever closer. In the dead of night, Sabrina awoke to a faint rustling outside her bedroom window. Her breath quickened, her heart racing. She peered through the curtains, but the garden was empty. Only the wind stirred the leaves, but she didn't see the small, shadowed figure watching from the distant tree line. She didn't see the faint glow of a phone screen capturing her panic, and she didn't hear Lillian's quiet whisper through the darkness. "Sleep well, Sabrina, because soon you won't." Weeks turned into months, and Lillian Monroe's silent war continued. But now, the shadows that had haunted Henry Caldwell and Sabrina Hale grew darker, closer, and more dangerous. Henry's paranoia reached new heights. He fired 2 more security teams, convinced they were incompetent. He replaced the mansion staff, installed new cameras, and doubled the guards at the estate. But no matter how tightly he tried to lock down his world, the fear remained. Sabrina, once the queen of the Monroe estate, was now a prisoner in her own gilded cage. Her glamorous parties had ceased, her laughter silenced. She rarely ventured beyond the bedroom, and even there she kept the curtains drawn tight. Her phone calls with Henry grew strained, each conversation ending in accusations and anger. "You're letting this get to you," Henry shouted during one heated exchange. "It's all in your head." "Is it?" Sabrina shot back, her voice shaking. "Then why do we keep getting those letters? Why do I keep hearing footsteps outside my door?" But Henry refused to admit his own fear. To him, this was an attack, a targeted assault by some unknown enemy. Someone was out to destroy him, and he was determined to find them. Lillian watched them both crumble from her mountain retreat, the live feeds and reports feeding her a constant stream of their misery. But her victory was not complete, not yet. "It's time to turn the board against him," Lillian whispered one evening, her fingers tracing the silver locket around her neck. "If I can't bring him down from the outside, I'll do it from within." Thomas Blake, her ally within Monroe Enterprises, had been quietly gathering evidence of Henry's reckless decisions, misappropriated funds, failed investments, and questionable expenses piled up like kindling ready to ignite. "The board is restless," Thomas reported during one of their secret meetings. "Henry's erratic behavior is making them nervous. He's lost millions in the past 3 months, but he refuses to explain where the money's going." "Perfect," Lillian replied, a cold smile touching her lips. "When the time is right, we'll make our move." But Henry was not completely oblivious. His paranoia made him suspicious of everyone, including Sabrina. He began to question her loyalty, accusing her of leaking information. "Are you betraying me?" he demanded one night, his voice a harsh whisper as he loomed over her. "Betraying you?" Sabrina's fear turned to fury. "I'm the only one who has stood by you. You're the one who dragged me into this." "Then why do they know so much?" Henry's eyes were wild, his grip on her wrist tightening. "Who have you been talking to?" "No one," she sobbed, wrenching free from his grasp. "But maybe they're watching us. Maybe they know everything because they're here." Her words struck a nerve. Henry turned, his gaze darting to the dark windows. For the first time, the house he had stolen felt like a prison. And then, the final blow came. At the next Monroe Enterprises board meeting, Thomas presented a comprehensive report, anonymously sourced, detailing Henry's reckless spending, his failed investments, and his secret attempts to transfer funds offshore. "This is madness," Henry shouted, slamming his fist on the table. "These are lies. Fabrications." But the evidence was undeniable. The board members exchanged wary glances, their respect for Henry's leadership eroding with every accusation. "Perhaps it's time for a leadership review," one member suggested, his voice calm but firm. "A review?" Henry's voice cracked. "You can't be serious." But they were. The vote was scheduled for the following week, and Henry's power was slipping through his fingers. Furious, he stormed out of the meeting, his mind racing. Back at the mansion, he found Sabrina pacing the living room, her fingers twisting a strand of hair nervously. "This is your fault," he roared, grabbing her by the shoulders. "If you hadn't been so weak." Weak! Sabrina's fear finally gave way to rage. "I never wanted any of this. You said she was dead." "You said it was over, but it's not, is it?" Tears filled her eyes. "It's like she's still here, watching us." Henry's grip loosened, and a cold chill ran down his spine. For the first time, he allowed himself to think the impossible. "No," he whispered, his voice trembling. "She's gone. I saw it happen. I made sure." But even as he said the words, they felt like a lie. That night, as Sabrina locked herself in the bedroom, Henry sat alone in his study, a glass of scotch shaking in his hand. The shadows seemed darker, the silence suffocating. Then his phone buzzed. A new email notification. From unknown. Subject: "You took everything. Now it's your turn." Henry's hands shook violently, the glass slipping from his grasp and shattering on the marble floor. He stared at the screen,
cold sweat pooling at his temples. "Lillian," he whispered, the name slipping from his lips like a curse. Across the mountains, Lillian smiled, her gaze fixed on the glowing screen before her. The trap was set. "You wanted everything, Henry," she whispered to the darkness. "Now you have it, and soon you'll lose it all." Lillian Monroe's trap was tightening, and Henry Caldwell was beginning to suffocate. But while he flailed and fought against the shadows closing in on him, Lillian remained a ghost, watching from afar, calculating each move. In the days leading up to the leadership review at Monroe Enterprises, Henry's desperation became palpable. He barged into board members' offices unannounced, pleaded with old allies, even tried to intimidate those who wavered. But the more he pushed, the more they recoiled. "You're losing control, Henry," whispered one of the senior members after a tense exchange. "Perhaps it's time you stepped back." Henry's response was a roar of denial. "I built this company. Lillian was weak, and without me, it would have crumbled. I deserve to lead." But even as he spoke, his voice lacked conviction. His once commanding presence was now a shadow of itself, his face pale, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights. At home, Sabrina's paranoia had become a prison. She refused to leave the mansion, kept the curtains drawn, and barely ate. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind against the windows made her jump. "We should leave, Henry," she whispered one night, clutching his arm as he poured another drink. "Get away from here. Please." "And run?" Henry scoffed, wrenching his arm free. "Like cowards." "No, this is my empire. I won't abandon it." But his bravado was an act. He too felt the walls closing in, the darkness thickening around him. And then the calls began. In the dead of night, the mansion's phone would ring. Henry would snatch the receiver, but there was only silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. Sabrina began refusing to answer, her hands shaking whenever the phone chimed. Then came the photos, delivered in plain envelopes, slid under the front door, tucked into the windshield of Henry's car. Images of Henry and Sabrina in the garden, laughing. Another of them seated by the fireplace, Sabrina's head resting on his shoulder. Each photo was accompanied by a single message. "Someone's always watching." Henry changed the locks, replaced the security team again, even brought in a private investigator. But no one could trace the source of the photos. No one could catch the ghost haunting them. And Lillian? She watched it all with quiet satisfaction. Each desperate measure, each fraying thread in their fragile lives was another victory. "They're destroying themselves," Daniel Carter observed one evening, standing beside Lillian in the warm glow of the cabin's fireplace. "Henry's unraveling." And Sabrina's one breath away from running. "Let her run," Lillian whispered. "But she won't. Not yet." Her plan was almost complete. The board was set to review Henry's leadership in a matter of days, and she had prepared one final, devastating blow. Through Thomas Blake, she ensured the board received a confidential report, a dossier of Henry's secret offshore accounts, his reckless spending, and the mounting debts he had hidden beneath false reports. The report ended with a simple, damning conclusion. Leadership without integrity is a threat to Monroe Enterprises. Henry never saw it coming. The board meeting, which he had once planned to dominate, became a tribunal. Questions flew at him like arrows. What happened to the missing funds, Henry? Can you explain these offshore accounts? Why are we hemorrhaging money under your leadership? Henry tried to fight back, but his denials fell flat. His voice, once commanding, was now desperate. "This is a setup! Lies! Fabrications!" he screamed, his fists slamming against the polished table. "Someone is sabotaging me!" But his rage only deepened the board's disdain. Thomas remained silent, watching with a calm, almost pitying expression. Finally, one of the senior members stood. "Effective immediately, we are suspending your leadership, Henry."
An interim CEO will be appointed until a full investigation is complete. Henry's world collapsed. Security escorted him from the boardroom, his protests ignored. Outside, photographers snapped pictures of his furious, pale face, his mouth twisted in anger. He stormed home, slamming the door behind him. Sabrina looked up from the couch, her face pale and drawn. "Henry? What happened?" "They've turned against me," he roared, knocking over a vase in his fury. "They've taken everything." Sabrina flinched, but then something shifted in her eyes. Fear gave way to something colder. "Maybe they're right," she whispered, standing slowly. "Maybe you've lost everything because you deserve to." "What did you say?" Henry's voice was deadly quiet. "You brought this on yourself, Henry," Sabrina screamed, backing away as he advanced. "You and your greed. You couldn't leave well enough alone." Henry lunged forward, grabbing her by the shoulders. "Don't you dare turn on me now, after everything I've done for you." Sabrina twisted free, stumbling back, her eyes wide with terror. "Done for me? You killed her, Henry. You killed Lillian. And now she's haunting us." Henry's face contorted with fury. "Lillian is dead. I made sure of it." But as the words left his mouth, they felt like ashes. He stumbled back, breathing heavily, the world spinning around him. And somewhere in the darkness, Lillian smiled, her fingers lightly tapping the silver locket around her neck. "Soon, Henry," she whispered, her voice a soft, chilling promise. "Very soon." Lillian Monroe's silent war was reaching its climax. From her mountain retreat, she watched as Henry Caldwell and Sabrina Hale's lives unraveled completely. The once grand Monroe mansion felt more like a haunted fortress, its opulent halls filled with tension and whispered accusations. Henry's suspension from Monroe Enterprises had shattered his fragile ego. He spent his days locked in his study, surrounded by half-empty glasses and torn documents. His phone calls grew frantic, his demands for answers met with cold indifference from board members who had once respected him. "They're cowards, all of them!" he shouted, slamming his fist against the desk. "After everything I've done, they betray me!" But it was more than betrayal, it was consequence. And deep down, Henry knew it. The weight of his own greed, his own crimes, was pressing down on him, suffocating him. But he refused to face it. Meanwhile, Sabrina's paranoia had become hysteria. She barely slept, barely ate, her once perfect appearance now a shadow of its former self. Dark circles marred her once beautiful face, and her hands trembled constantly. "Henry, we need to leave," she whispered one night, her voice barely above a whimper. "Please, just take the money and let's go." "There is no money!" Henry screamed, his voice raw with fury. "You think I haven't tried?" "Everything is locked down, frozen! They're trying to ruin me!" "Who?" Sabrina's voice cracked. "Who is doing this to us?" Henry's gaze shifted, his eyes narrowing. "Someone who hates us. Someone who wants revenge." And for the first time, Sabrina dared to speak the name that had haunted her dreams. "Lillian!" Henry's face twisted with rage. "Lillian is dead. I made sure of it." "I watched her fall." "Did you?" Sabrina whispered, stepping back. "Or did you just want her gone so badly that you convinced yourself?" Henry's hands clenched into fists. "I won't listen to this." But he did listen. Every night, he listened to the silence that had become deafening. He stared at the security monitors, watching the shadows dance across the mansion's gardens, his eyes bloodshot and wild. And Lillian watched him. Each night, Daniel Carter sent her fresh footage from the hidden cameras they had installed. Henry's madness, Sabrina's despair, it was all captured, a slow descent into chaos. "They're at their breaking point," Daniel remarked one evening, leaning against the fireplace as Lillian studied the feeds. "Henry's grasping at ghosts. Sabrina's one whisper away from running." "But she won't," Lillian whispered. "Not yet."
Her final move was ready.
Through Thomas Blake, she ensured that Monroe Enterprises board received one last anonymous package, a collection of Henry's offshore accounts, his secret deals, and the fraudulent documents he had used to seize control. But at the bottom of the file was a final twist, a forged document signed by Henry confessing to the embezzlement.
"They'll see it as a desperate confession," Lillian whispered, her fingers lightly tracing the silver locket around her neck.
"And they'll bury him." When the board convened, Henry barged in, demanding answers, his voice a hoarse shout, but the members ignored his outbursts, their eyes cold.
"This is your final chance, Henry," Thomas announced calmly.
"Resign quietly, and we may consider sparing you public disgrace."
"Spare me?" Henry's voice cracked. "You can't do this. I built this company."
"No, you stole it," another member replied, her tone icy.
"From your wife." Henry's rage faltered, his face going pale. "This is a setup. It has to be." But they didn't listen. The vote was unanimous.
Henry was formally removed, his accounts frozen, his assets seized for investigation. Security escorted him from the building, his shouts echoing down the marble halls. Back at the mansion, Sabrina was already packing.
Her trembling hands shoved designer dresses into a suitcase, her breaths coming in sharp, shallow gasps. But as she reached for her jewelry box, she froze. Inside was a single black envelope, her name written in elegant script. With shaking fingers, she opened it. "Running won't save you, Sabrina. The truth always catches up." Her scream echoed through the empty halls.
Henry returned to the mansion to find her gone, her car missing, the closets empty. In a fit of rage, he stormed through the house, knocking over furniture, shattering glass, screaming her name, but there was only silence. Finally, he collapsed in the study, breathing heavily, his hands clawing at his hair.
"Lillian," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Please, if you're out there, please stop." But the shadows did not answer. Across the mountains, Lillian watched the live feed, her gaze calm, her expression unreadable. "They always beg for mercy," she whispered, "when it's too late."
Lillian Monroe's plan was almost complete, but she knew the final blow had to be perfect. Henry Caldwell was a broken man, cast out from Monroe Enterprises, betrayed by his own greed, and abandoned by Sabrina. He was a shadow of himself. But Lillian wasn't done. From her mountain retreat, she continued to watch him, her gaze cold and calculating. Henry had become paranoid to the point of madness. He stayed in the mansion, pacing the halls like a trapped animal, shouting at shadows, smashing mirrors, and drowning himself in expensive scotch. Each night, his phone would ring, silent calls with no voice on the other end. He would snatch the receiver, scream into the void, and then hurl the phone across the room. Lillian's final move began with a single envelope, delivered in the dead of night, slipped beneath the heavy front doors of the mansion. Henry found it the next morning, his trembling hands struggling to tear it open. Inside was a single stark message. "Confess, and I may let you live." His hands shook so badly he nearly dropped the note. His vision blurred, his heart raced. He tore through the mansion, shouting into the empty halls, "Who are you? What do you want from me?" But only silence answered him. Desperation turned to obsession. Henry's days were spent staring at security monitors, his nights spent wandering the dark corridors of the mansion. He barely slept, barely ate. His clothes hung loose on his frame, his once sharp features now gaunt and hollow. And then the whispers began. Standing alone in his study, Henry would hear faint, whispered words drifting through the darkness. At first, he dismissed them as the wind, his own mind playing tricks on him, but they grew louder, clearer. "Murderer. Thief. She trusted you." Henry's screams echoed through the empty halls, his fists slamming against the walls. But the whispers never stopped. Lillian's plan was a symphony of fear.
Daniel Carter ensured the sound system installed in the mansion's walls, part of the original design, could be remotely accessed.
Each night, Lillian activated the whispers, her voice recorded and distorted, drifting like a ghost through the mansion. Henry's paranoia reached its peak. He locked himself in his study, barricaded the doors, and curled up beneath the grand mahogany desk. He whispered Lillian's name over and over, his voice a desperate, broken plea. And then the final letter arrived. This time, it was delivered directly to his desk, though the doors and windows were locked. Henry found it at dawn, his hands shaking as he read the words. "Tonight, the truth comes for you." Henry's panic became madness. He smashed the security monitors, shattered the windows, screamed into the darkness until his voice was raw. "Show yourself, face me." But Lillian did not answer. Instead, she prepared her final act. Dressed in a sleek black coat, her hair swept back, she stepped out of the mountain cabin and into Daniel's waiting car. Her eyes were cold, her expression unreadable. "He's ready," Daniel murmured, his voice steady. "But are you?" "I have been ready since the night he tried to kill me," Lillian replied, her voice sharp as glass. The drive to the mansion was silent, the night air crisp and clear. Stars sparkled above, indifferent to the chaos that awaited below. As they approached the grand estate, Lillian's gaze never wavered, her fingers lightly tracing the silver locket around her neck. Inside the mansion, Henry cowered in the study, the broken phone cradled in his hands, his eyes wild with fear. Shadows seemed to stretch across the walls, the darkness pressing in. And then, a single, deliberate knock echoed through the silent halls. Henry's breath hitched. He stumbled to his feet, backing against the desk. "No, no, leave me alone!" The knock came again, louder, more forceful. "Who's there?" Henry screamed, his voice cracking. "What do you want?" Silence. And then the door swung open. Lillian stepped into the study, her silhouette framed by the cold moonlight streaming through the shattered window. She was a ghost made flesh, her gaze piercing, her presence suffocating. "Hello, Henry," she whispered, her voice calm, almost gentle. Henry's knees buckled and he collapsed to the floor. "Lillian, please, I thought you were dead." Lillian's lips curved into a cold smile. "You tried, didn't you?" "But I'm not so easy to kill." I didn't, he babbled, crawling toward her, his hands clutching at the hem of her coat. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean it. Sabrina made me do it." "Sabrina is gone," Lillian replied, her voice like ice, "and soon, so will you." Henry's pleading turned to sobs. "Please, please don't." Lillian leaned down, her gaze fierce. "You took everything from me, Henry. My home, my life. You even tried to take my child." "But you forgot one thing." What?" he choked. "You never truly had power. You only had fear. And now, I've taken that from you too." Henry's sobs became wails, his fingers clawing at the floor, his voice hoarse with desperation. "Lillian, please." But Lillian turned, her voice a whisper that drifted through the darkness. "Goodbye, Henry." Daniel stepped forward, pulling Henry to his feet. "It's over." The next morning, Henry was found wandering the streets, disheveled, mumbling incoherently about ghosts and shadows. The mansion was empty, the doors wide open, the whispers gone. And Lillian? She watched from afar, her gaze steady, her heart unburdened. "It's done," she whispered, her fingers lightly touching the locket. "He's nothing now." The morning light broke over the Monroe estate, casting long shadows across the manicured gardens and the silent, empty halls. The once grand mansion was a husk, a hollow shell stripped of its grandeur, its master reduced to a wandering ghost. Henry Caldwell had been found hours earlier, stumbling through the streets, muttering incoherently to anyone who would listen. The media descended upon him like vultures, capturing images of the disheveled man who had once been a powerful CEO. Headlines screamed of his downfall. Disgraced businessman found raving in the streets, billionaire's empire crumbles, and most damning of all, secrets of Monroe Mansion exposed. But for Lillian Monroe, the world's shock meant nothing. She watched it all from her mountain cabin, her gaze calm, her heart steady.
Daniel Carter stood beside her, his expression a mix of quiet satisfaction and caution. "It's done," he whispered. "Henry's finished."
Sabrina is gone, and Monroe Enterprises has already begun its recovery without him. Lillian's fingers traced the silver locket around her neck, a quiet smile touching her lips. "He took everything from me. I returned the favor." But her victory was not just in Henry's destruction. It was in her own survival. She had reclaimed what was hers, her life, her legacy, her power. And now it was time to return. 1 week later, the board of Monroe Enterprises gathered in the grand conference room, their expressions tense. The scandal of Henry's downfall had rocked the company, and investors were nervous. But they were about to receive a shock even greater. As the doors opened, a hush fell over the room. Lillian Monroe stepped in, her figure elegant and commanding, her gaze sharp and unyielding. The whispers began immediately. "Is that? It can't be. She's alive?" Lillian moved to the head of the table, her calm smile never wavering. "Good morning, gentlemen," she began, her voice steady. "I apologize for the surprise, but I believe it's time I took my rightful place." Thomas Blake rose, his expression a mixture of shock and relief. "Lillian, it really is you." "Yes, Thomas," she replied, her smile softening. "I never left." She presented her case with the same poise she had always possessed. The documents proving her survival, the evidence of Henry's betrayal, his financial crimes, and his final, desperate collapse. Monroe Enterprises had been stolen from her, but now it was hers again. The vote was unanimous. Lillian Monroe was reinstated as CEO. But her return was not just a matter of power. It was a matter of redemption. Her first order of business was a complete audit of the company, cleansing it of the corruption Henry had brought in. Staff members who had been loyal to him were dismissed, and those who had remained faithful to Lillian were promoted. "We rebuild, but we do so with integrity," she announced at her first board meeting. "This company will stand for something again." But Lillian's work did not end with the company. Back at the mansion, she walked through the empty halls, her footsteps echoing against the cold marble floors. Memories surrounded her. Moments of happiness, of betrayal, of despair. But she was not the same woman who had once called this place home. The rooms had been cleared of Henry and Sabrina's influence, the gaudy furniture replaced, the paintings restored to their original places. It was her home again, but it felt different. It felt empty. "You've won, you know." Daniel's voice broke the silence, his familiar presence a comfort. "Did I?" Lillian whispered, her gaze drifting to the grand window overlooking the garden. "I reclaimed everything. But at what cost?" Daniel stepped closer, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "At the cost of your freedom, at the cost of a lie. But now you have a chance to live again." A faint smile touched Lillian's lips. "Live again," she whispered. Weeks passed, and the world adjusted to the return of Lillian Monroe. Her leadership brought stability back to Monroe Enterprises, and her strength became a symbol of resilience. But Lillian knew that her true victory was not in the company or the mansion. It was in her own survival. One evening, as the sun set over the mountains, she stood in the garden, the cool breeze brushing against her face. The silver locket around her neck felt warm against her skin, a reminder of her father's words, "Strength through patience." "You were right, Father," she whispered. "Strength isn't just in power, it's in endurance." But as she turned to leave, her phone buzzed with a message. a single line that sent a chill down her spine. "Did you really think it was over?" Her breath caught. The shadows seemed to stretch across the garden, the silence deepening. "Daniel," she called out, her voice steady but urgent. "We may have another problem." The message on Lillian Monroe's phone was a cold, silent whisper in the warm glow of her reclaimed estate.
"Did you really think it was over?" Those words, so simple, so ominous, sent a chill racing down her spine. But Lillian wasn't the same woman she had once been, naive, trusting, and vulnerable. She was a survivor now, a warrior who had risen from the grave they tried to bury her in.
"Daniel," she called, her voice steady but firm. Within moments, Daniel Carter appeared at her side, his expression immediately tense as he saw the look in her eyes. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low.
Lillian handed him the phone, the message displayed like a silent threat. Daniel's jaw tightened. "I thought we were done with this." "So did I," Lillian murmured, her gaze drifting toward the darkening sky beyond the garden.
But someone thinks otherwise. For days, Lillian's calm exterior masked a quiet storm. She continued her work at Monroe Enterprises, strengthening the company, restoring its integrity, and winning back the trust of investors. But beneath her poised demeanor, she was a hunter once more, searching for the shadow that threatened her peace. Surveillance was increased around the estate, and Daniel ensured the mansion's security system was state-of-the-art. Staff were vetted, cameras were monitored, and Lillian's personal devices were secured, but nothing unusual appeared. No strange faces, no suspicious activity, just the constant, suffocating weight of that message. Until the letter arrived. It was delivered to the mansion's front door, wrapped in plain white paper, sealed with a black wax emblem, a snake devouring its own tail. Lillian's fingers trembled only slightly as she broke the seal. "You stole what wasn't yours, Lillian. You think you're safe, but secrets have a way of returning." Daniel read the note over her shoulder, his eyes narrowing. "Whoever this is, they know about Henry.
They know about everything. Or they think they do," Lillian whispered, her mind racing. "But this isn't Henry. He's finished. It has to be someone else." But who? Sabrina was gone, vanished without a trace. Henry was lost, wandering the streets in disgrace. Monroe Enterprises was secure. So who was left? Days turned into nights, and the silence became suffocating. Lillian's calm facade began to crack, her sleep haunted by nightmares of drowning, of voices whispering her name. And then, one night, the whispers returned. Lillian bolted upright in bed, her breath ragged, her heart racing. But this was no dream. The whispers drifted through the darkness, faint but clear. "Thief, liar, murderer." Her gaze snapped to the door. It was locked. The windows were secure. Yet the whispers grew louder. "You took everything. Now it's your turn." Lillian stumbled out of bed, her hands shaking. She grabbed her phone, dialing Daniel's number, but before he could answer, the whispers ceased. The room fell silent, heavy, oppressive. By the time Daniel arrived, Lillian was pacing, her fingers tracing the silver locket around her neck, her expression a mixture of fear and fury. "They were here," she whispered. "I heard them. I checked the security feeds." "No one's come near the house," Daniel insisted, his voice calm but concerned. "Lillian, you've been through so much. Maybe—" "Don't!" she snapped, her eyes flashing. Don't tell me I'm imagining this. But even as she spoke, a cold doubt clawed at her. Was it real? Or was the ghost of her past consuming her? But Lillian was not one to surrender. She doubled the security, reinforced the mansion's defenses, and dug into the company's archives, searching for any name, any trace of someone who might have a grudge. But there was nothing. Until the night of the charity gala,
Monroe Enterprises had restored its reputation, and the annual gala was a chance to display its strength. Lillian stood beneath the grand chandeliers, her elegant gown shimmering, her calm smile concealing the tension beneath. But as she mingled with guests, a server slipped a note onto her tray.
Lillian's fingers trembled as she unfolded it. The truth is closer than you think. Her gaze shot to the crowd, searching for any familiar face, any sign of a threat. But there were only smiles, laughter, polite applause.
And then she saw him, a tall, silver-haired man in a dark suit, watching her from the far end of the hall. His gaze met hers, cold and calculating. But as she stepped forward, he vanished into the crowd. "Daniel!" she called, but her voice was drowned in the swell of music. She pushed through the guests, her heart racing, her eyes scanning every face, but the man was gone.
"Lillian!" Daniel's voice pulled her back, his hand on her shoulder. "What happened?" "He was here," she whispered, her voice shaking. "The one who's been taunting me."
"He was here." Daniel's expression darkened. "We need to leave. Now." Back at the mansion, Lillian's mind raced. The whispers, the letters, the message. Someone was playing with her. But who? And why? And then the final letter arrived. Left on her desk, in her private study, impossible to reach without being seen. "You thought you knew everything, but you never knew me." Her hands clenched around the paper, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. But then something shifted within her, a quiet, fierce determination. "Whoever you are," she whispered, her voice like steel, "you don't know me either." She turned to Daniel, her eyes blazing. "It's time we went hunting." In life, we may face betrayal, heartbreak, and unimaginable losses, even from those we trust the most. But the story of Lillian Monroe reminds us that true strength lies not in avoiding hardship, but in how we rise from it. Lillian was deceived, nearly destroyed by those she loved. But instead of giving up, she chose resilience. She used her intelligence, patience, and courage to reclaim her life and restore her dignity. Her journey teaches us that no matter how broken we may feel, we have the power to rebuild ourselves, to stand strong again. For older audiences, this story is a powerful reminder that it is never too late to reclaim your worth, to demand respect, and to write a new chapter. In a world where trust can be broken, integrity, perseverance, and self-respect are the greatest forms of strength.